We've talked about immigration a little bit, about what's up for debate. We talked about, remember, that there's a debate between assimilation and multiculturalism. So assimilation was once sort of the orthodox position. It's like, hey, you guys, if you come here, you need to melt into the melting pot and just assimilate. Whereas the heterodox opinion was more, yeah, we can have different cultures within society and everybody can just be, I don't know, more like the salad bowl metaphor instead of the melting pot. Now we talked about the immigration debate is, should we throw them out really fast or maybe slow it down a little bit? Basically, my take on it right now. But we're not going to have that debate because that debate you can have in your own life. What does that debate assume? When I talk about immigration and people coming into the country, by the way, we're not the only place having this debate. And I'm like, what are all these people coming into my country from? What is the doxa there? What is assumed? Yeah. Sadly, who is saying that immigrants are good? It's odd to think because we are supposedly a nation of immigrants, but yeah, there are very few people who are talking about the net positive contribution of immigrants, that even undocumented immigrants are paying taxes, for example. Very few people are talking about that. That has become doxa, but I'm thinking about the very phrase, they're coming into my country. Here, look at the world. That is the actual world. It's a little bit longer than you thought it would be. Yeah, this is an actual world with the equator in the middle of the map. You rarely see these kinds of worlds. I'll show you a different world in a little bit, but this is the real world to scale. What else is true about the world? Yeah. Obviously, there are natural borders. There's rivers, there's mountains, there's deserts. But the way we've drawn countries are just wherever we wanted to, right? Yeah, sometimes we follow a river, a mountain range, sometimes, but look at the Canadian border. It's just a fucking line across. It's like, there's your border. Right? In Mexico, at least, you have the Rio Grande, and there's a river there or something. But for most, there's no actual countries or borders in the world. And so when I say the whole immigration, when I say immigration, it depends on the doxa that people belong in countries and that countries are defined by borders. No, I'm not saying, obviously, that is our reality. I'm just saying, whenever we're having a great debate about immigration, we assume that everybody should belong to a country and that everybody that is coming from one country is coming from one country into another country. And once you step across some magical line, all of a sudden you're in a different place. If you read about where the wall is being built along Mexico, it's actually not being built on the border. So there are people with properties that are actually in the United States, but they're on the other side of the wall. And so they have to go through the wall. It's unbelievable when you think there's whole towns that are US citizens, but they happen to be on the other side of this wall that we're building. And so they always have to go through the wall to get to the other side where they are. See what I'm saying? It's weird. There's ranches, there's all kinds of properties down there that have found themselves on the wrong side of the wall. I'm trying to say is these borders are something that we made. If we put a wall there, then it becomes more real, but it's not even accurate. So this is all getting, I actually prefer to talk about this not as immigration, but as migration. Because if you look back at the world, migration is what we do as human beings. That's how we moved around in Africa, human mobility, and migrated from place to place. That's how we migrated from Africa and back into Africa and outside of Africa and then into the Americas and Australia and all these places. This is one of the oldest adaptive strategies that human beings have. And if you curtail people and keep them from being able to migrate and move, it creates all kinds of problems because that's what we do as human beings. We've always been doing it. Now, the longest period of or the biggest percentage of migration is not in our times. In terms of a percentage of people moving around from place to place, I think the largest in percentages was in a time that some historians call the long 19th century, from the French Revolution up to World War I, which was a time when almost 1 million people a year were moving either from Europe into the Americas. People were obviously still being moved from Africa and from Asia into the Caribbean and into the United States and different places. And the percentage of people who moved around during this time was perhaps the largest. And so we get weirded out by immigration today, or it feels new to us in a way that's strange, because back 100 and so years ago, we were at the all-time high of US residents who were foreign born. And so at 14.7%. We're not there today. We're slightly under, but we haven't reached back to that 1910 high. Now, what then happened is that the 1920s, like many of the people who immigrated into the United States, including my ancestors, did around this time, or in the long 19th century. But in the 1920s, there were a series of immigration restrictions that were especially levied against Asians. They were sometimes called the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and basically clamped down on almost all immigration, but especially from Asia, until about 1965. And so during this time, there was a huge restriction on immigration. And what happened is that during that time, that's when some of these people that we talked about, who were like, we didn't know where they'd fit into American society, like the Irish or the Italians, that's when they get put into that melting pot and become suburban whites. What I'm saying is that, yeah, we see today, for example, people talk about different places and they say, oh, they're not fitting in, they're not assimilating, they're all living together. But that's what people were doing before. Yeah, people lived in Little Italy, and that's where the Italians lived. And they weren't fitting in. They eventually did melt in, but it takes time. It's this slow thing. Yeah, no, I told you that we discussed this during the language thing. In all immigrant groups, even the people who are Spanish speakers today, by the second generation, you're speaking English, and by the third generation, you don't have any of your original language. Yeah, my grandparents too, they insisted that they speak English at home to get ahead in school. Next thing you know, now I don't speak Italian. But yeah, they too had that assimilation model. So the idea was here, and actually in other countries as well, that people were going to assimilate. So the idea is, okay, we're going to take these people who immigrated and we're going to assimilate them. And in the 1930s, there was actually a pretty large Mexican population in the United States, but with the Great Depression, there was something that was called Mexican repatriation, where people were taken from, or in some cases, quite willingly, because there weren't that many jobs in the United States, and they were basically put back across the border. But at that time, there wasn't much of a border in terms of border enforcement. People just went back and forth. And the United States also developed what was called the Bracero program, where they would take migrant farm workers and they'd be regulated, and they'd come to the farms in the United States for the time that they were supposed to work, and then they would go back to Mexico. And so what this all added up to is that in 1970, so at about 50 years ago, we reached what we might consider the all-time low of immigration at 4.7%. And so if you think about the people who came of age in 1970, say some of the baby boomers, say one of the candidates, actually it used to be both of our candidates for president. This was the world they were living in, where it was not very many people were immigrants. It was our all-time low. And so their world was like this. Now, in comparison to the real world, what's wrong with this map? Yeah, it's not proportional. What is especially disproportional? Greenland is not that big. Many people who grow up with the Mercator projection believes that Greenland is about as big as South America. However, South America in real life is actually 9 times as big as Greenland. 9 times. So this is a pretty distorted map in terms of it really prioritizes the northern parts. Also notice, wait, what is an equator supposed to do? Why is it called an equator? It's equal. But you'll notice on this map, the equator is only a third up the map. So it's not equal at all. 2/3 of the map is in the north.
Sun, right, is warmer, the equator.
It is usually warmer on the equator, although it depends how, yeah, for those of us, yeah, if you've been to South America or in my Latin America class, you know, it depends on altitude. So it can be cold too, but yeah, it's tropical.
How disproportionate maps were when I was little, I used to think the equator cut through the bottom half of Florida.
Yeah, that's what you'd think. You'd think the equator was here. So this was an especially egregious example, but I grew up with some of these maps. There's one other thing that's problematic about this map. There's 2 Chinas. It doesn't make any sense to make a map like this if you're cutting a whole continent in half. But this is the map, this is the worldview that a lot of people grew up with. So some of the restrictions on immigration, they weren't necessarily lifted, but at least, for example, the Asian Exclusion Acts were eliminated. There were still very strict quotas. But one of the things that happened is in the 1970s, the United States wanted certain groups for their labor, and they actually often recruited them from different places. So when you look at the migrations and the immigrations that we see, oftentimes they're connected to some sort of colonial political relationship that this country has had over time. It's probably especially obvious, for example, with the UK or Britain and India, and how much, if you go to London today, the best food is Indian curries because there's so many wonderful places to eat, but it's part of a colonial political relationship that was had over time. Or people were in a Cold War conflict zone. So, for example, when a lot of people come into the United States coming up from Nicaragua or Honduras or Guatemala, and we're like, what are these people doing here? Well, there were huge conflicts, which were oftentimes funded by the United States, that made these places very difficult to live in and very violent. And so people were trying to escape those. Or people got pulled into a specific industry or, you know, a specific place because people still needed workers during this time. So what am I doing? My own family, in some ways, on my side, there's that Italian thing. On my wife's side, so her parents are from South Korea, and they were brought to the United States as doctors. So the United States had a doctor shortage, and so they pulled them into New York City to work in some of the hospitals. They had done their medical training in Korea, but they were pulled in as doctors. We also had a nursing shortage, and so they pulled in nurses from the Philippines. And so my wife's parents were working with these Filipino nurses, and when I first looked at my wife's baby pictures, I was very struck that her ears were pierced from day one. Anybody else have their ears pierced as a baby? Usually in American society, this is something that you get in a big fight with your parents and then you go out and pierce them anyway, at least in the old days. Nobody ever did this. In many societies in Latin America, the first thing you do is pierce a girl's ears, so that they're a girl. And the same thing, they do that in the Philippines too, because they were under Spanish colonialism, in some way similar to Latin America. And so, yes, they have this tradition of piercing the kids' ears. Piercing the kids' ears is not a South Korean tradition or a Korean tradition. So I was very struck by this. And my mother-in-law said, no, it was the Filipina nurses. They're the ones that said, you got to get her ears pierced. And so you have this little Korean baby with ears pierced. And so the reason they did is they thought that was the American thing to do because of what the Filipina nurses said. You had this very odd interaction of people, but all of them were being pulled into very specific ethnic labor recruitment into a specific industry. And also in terms of people who were working in farm work or now in chicken processing plants or different meat packing industries. Let us say that you used to get your workers from Mexico in the Bracero program for your farm, or let us say you're running a chicken farm and you have, how are you going to get good workers for your farm? How do you recruit them? Besides money, yeah, you're not paying very much money, so you need good workers, but you don't know where to get them. Yeah, this is the cultural capital of being a boss. You ask the good workers that you already have if they can bring over some more people for you. You use your own workers and you say, hey, you got any friends? You got any family members? Can you come work on my farm? And so people get pulled into a specific place. And so you'll go to some of these towns and you'll wonder, like, how did all these people from this one town in Mexico get to here? Well, it has a lot to do with labor recruitment. A Cold War conflict zone, the Sudan. Yeah, there's so many sad places in the world, but that one is definitely one of the more intense ones. And I don't know the entire history, but I do know that like throughout Africa was one of the places where the United States and the Soviet Union were putting their different militias and funding different groups who we now say are ethnic conflicts, but the money and the arms originally came from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s Cold War conflicts. And so what was happening here is that in addition to the pull of the United States and these political things, is that there was once this idea in the 1920s and 1930s that each nation, each country would be able to industrialize and have their own good life. There's this desire that people have for a middle class lifestyle all over the world, and so they're looking for. And oftentimes in their own country, they feel limited by what's going on with gender norms, even in places that we might not consider to be as traditional as other societies. People sometimes feel very limited in their own social class or tradition. And so being able to migrate gives you an opportunity to break out from that. And so what happens is during the 1970s and now, you have people coming in from these different places. They weren't coming in randomly. And many of them were pulled into the United States because of labor shortages. It wasn't like they were taking jobs. They were actually pulled in order to perform jobs that needed to be done, like doctors and nurses and chicken farms. But for many people who grew up in the 1970s are like, oh my God, where are all these people coming from? What's going on with my country? What do we do with them? It's not that, it isn't that unusual. But for people who came of age in the 1970s, their world is exploding. Their world has just been turned upside down. That is actually also the real world, by the way. There's no reason to put the North on top.
I don't mind this map.
You don't mind it? I feel like it makes me dizzy if I look at it too long. I don't like to look at it. It looks too weird.
I feel like Australia belongs up there. They're just weird.
They do belong up there, don't they? Yes, Australians do belong up there. They belong up there in their own. Yeah.
A country that looks correct.
It would be interesting if the Australians, is anybody Australian here? No. It'd be interesting if they thought that it looks correct. I just think because it looks like a blob, that they might get mad if we put them upside down.
I think it looks like less of a blob.
Huh?
It looks like only Australia looks like upside down.
It looks upside
And they're
down.
down under. Now they look fine. Now they're up top.
They should, yeah, well, they should be happy with this map. The Chileans too, and Argentinians.
Maybe Florida. Florida might be cold now. No, it's still down. It's
Florida looks like it's flipping us off, which it often is. Yeah, yeah, I feel like that's the flip you off state. Okay. My message on migration in the immigrant interview is most people who are migrating want what anyone else wants. And they're, in most cases, are a net positive to society or doing jobs that other people aren't doing. And it's a very ancient adaptive strategy, but we'll see how it goes.